Well, welcome back. I want to begin a series where we have a conversation about some documents in the church where it previously approved of slavery. This is something that has come up because Pope Leo, in his new encyclical, his first encyclical, Pope Leo the 14th apologizes for the church's role in authorizing and legitimizing, to use his word, slavery. And this is, something that is very welcome and good to see. We have seen some statements by John Paul II previously, and now Pope Leo the 14th is adding to that apology. And a lot of people may be confused. They might be wondering, hey, where is this coming from? I didn't know that the church approved of slavery. Aren't there documents where the popes have rejected slavery and stuff like that? Well, let's talk about those cases where they did authorize and legitimize, make use of, have, own slaves. Popes, church councils, church fathers, Catholic societies, Catholic countries in their laws and all of that. So I want to begin the series talking about all of this, and today we're going to start with some councils that approved of slavery for women and also for children, where these were to be slaves of the church in servitude to the church for their entire lives, usually because of a crime that they did not commit, but somebody related to them committed. We'll talk about that here in a moment. And then in the next show, we'll probably go over papal bulls approving of slavery. There were some that rejected it and discouraged it, but others approved of it. So we're going to talk about those. Then after that, we will do church fathers. And then in a final episode, we'll talk about some of the laws of various Catholic countries that authorized, made use of slavery. Okay. And this has really become of interest to me personally, not just because of Pope Leo, but I went to New Orleans and I was checking out the Ursuline convent that they have there that is very old. And the tour guide was talking about how all of the slaves in New Orleans were required to be baptized. Like they were forced to be baptized, forced to become Christians, because they were either pagans or Muslims prior to that, just depending on where they came from. And they were forced to be baptized. And that caught my attention. Everyone in the city of New Orleans was required to be baptized. So these were forced conversions. And obviously, these were slaves that were being forced to convert. So it got me looking into French Catholic law at the time, on slavery, on forced baptisms, forced conversions, which unfortunately is something very, very common throughout church history. Perhaps we'll do a whole series on that. But that's really what sparked my interest, was going to the Ursuline convent and him having mentioned that. And so in light of, however, Pope Leo the 14th apologizing for this and people probably not knowing what he's referring to, we're going to go over this. All right, so I want to start here with something written by John Francis Maxwell, Slavery in the Catholic Church. This is a book that is written by a professed Catholic. His book is endorsed by the clergy. It has a nihil obstat and also an imprimatur, for whatever that's worth, right? And he goes over some of these examples. And it is fascinating. He starts the book out with, why did it take the church so long to condemn slavery? And he gives a lot of reasons, but his number one reason is because the church approved of slavery for so long, it became hard for it to come out and condemn slavery, because that would put into the minds of the average person, how can that which the church has approved of and authorized and taught for so long now be condemned and considered an error? And that's probably what a lot of people are thinking now, right? Well, that's also when he wrote the book, that's the observation that he made, is that it took a very long time because the church would have to admit it was wrong. It was teaching error on this particular point for very long. Now, he tries to save the day by saying, well, none of these documents taught it infallibly. They taught it in the ordinary magisterium, but not infallibly. And so that saves the day. That's not going to be satisfactory for most people who obviously are aware that the vast majority of the church's teachings are not infallible. Does that then mean the majority of the church's teachings can be heretical and erroneous, and the church can teach heresy for 2,000 years as long as it's not infallible? This is a point that I've brought up, for 4 or 5 years now, about the question of the ordinary magisterium, the extent of error. It's the topic of my dissertation, so it's one of interest to me. But that's why I was fascinated by his response there. His answer was, well, it's not infallible. That doesn't solve the dilemma, because again, if the church can teach for 2,000 years some kind of error and heresy in its ordinary magisterium, that severely weakens the authority of the church. So a solution that is better than, well, it wasn't infallible, needs to be provided. And this is why I have encouraged the magisterium to offer a solution rather than maybe waste time on some of this other stuff like the synod on synodality and a whole bunch of stuff that isn't very effective or helpful or fruitful, frankly. But all right, let's maybe go over some of the examples that he gives, which are not exhaustive in nature. Let me share my screen and show you what he's referring to here. Okay, so slavery imposed as an ecclesiastical penalty by church councils. And he notes here that this was done by both the civil laws and also ecclesiastical laws. So he mentions under Roman civil law, persons convicted of certain crimes and duly sentenced could suffer the lifelong capital punishment of slavery. And this carried into the church because the church fathers, as we'll see in a future episode, they did uphold human dignity. But they said, but there's also original sin and there's also consequences to actual sin, and slavery is thus ordained by God as a consequence to sin. Nowadays, the magisterium is really laying hard this idea of human dignity and is saying, well, before in the past, we didn't really recognize human dignity, and that's why we allowed for death penalty and slavery. Now that we recognize human dignity, we can condemn these things. Well, it's not as simple as that, because the church fathers recognize human dignity. They discuss that on the topic of slavery, and they still affirm slavery, not because of some issue of not recognizing human dignity, but rather because of the question of original sin and actual sin. So that's how they justified it, right? And that's not something that the magisterium has currently engaged or tackled or accounted for. Okay. But it notes, after the barbarian invasions and the fall of the Roman Empire, penal slavery was still used by both civil and ecclesiastical authorities. So it came into the church, especially under Roman civil law. And then it came into the law of Catholic states, especially through Justinian's code, and then into ecclesiastical laws through church councils and also popes. Okay, for example, he says in the Visigothic kingdom in 633, the Fourth Council of Toledo, presided over by Saint Isidore of Seville. I think Isidore of Seville is the doctor of the church, if I'm not mistaken. Very, very famous saint. And by the way, this council is also very famous. The Fourth Council of Toledo, you probably recognize it because it's well known for its affirmation of the filioque, the dogma of the filioque. And the filioque really inserted itself into the Spanish churches through this particular council. and really spread from there. So the question of the development of the dogma of the filioque is in part related to the Fourth Council of Toledo because it had a very strong hand in that. So you probably recognize it from that. But he mentions the Fourth Council of Toledo, presided over by Saint Isidore of Seville, made provision for clerics who were not lawfully married and were having forbidden relations with foreign women or their own female slaves. You remember in the West, celibacy was a huge discipline. In the East, you have married clergy, but in the West, they were heavily promoting celibacy. And so there was this situation, and has been, really have been for the vast majority of church history, where you have married priests in the East, but you also have celibate priests in the West who had concubines and had these relationships with women. And so it's saying, for the clerics who were not lawfully married and were having forbidden relations with foreign women or their own female slaves, the council decreed, yes, clergy owned slaves. In fact, Pope Leo actually mentions that in his apology. He doesn't mention that popes owned slaves as well, but he does mention that clergy owned slaves. The council decreed that such women were to be taken away by the bishop and put up for sale as slaves, and the guilty clerics were to do penance. And so, who's punished here? The women. The male priests weren't, although in some cases they performed penance, they weren't penalized as much as women and children of these relationships were. So the bishop can go take the wife, make her a slave, and make her a slave to the church for the rest of her life. And so, look, you can see some injustice here, right? Shouldn't it be the clergy that receive the blunt of the punishment rather than the laity? Unfortunately, it was more the laity that were subject to these penalties. Again, in 655 AD, the Ninth Council of Toledo decreed that the penalty of enslavement was to be imposed not on the priests who offended against clerical celibacy. So again, the priests are given this special status. Clergy are given this special status, while the laity receive the blunt, or the bulk, I should say, of the punishment. Not on the priests who offended against clerical celibacy, but on their offspring, so on their children, who would remain permanently in slavery to the church. So they would say the children have to be punished, not just the wives, but the children, and they have to be reduced to servitude and slavery for the rest of their life, and in service to the church, not even to like some kind of civil secular master, but rather to the church itself. This was then incorporated into Western Church's collection of canons. So it's not like this is kind of a one-off thing. It was very common among these councils, but then it was put into the Code of Canon Law. So you probably know, you have in 1917, the Code of Canon Law was promulgated. Then you have this kind of second version in 1983 by John Paul II. Well, what happened prior to 1917? Was there just like no canon law? No, there was. But they used Gratian's Decretum. And these canons were incorporated into Gratian's Decretum, which was used up until 1917. So from 655 until, actually from earlier, because you have it being incorporated in the canon law prior to that. Okay. In 1012 AD, a similar decree was enacted by the Council of Pavia concerning the children of clerics. By the way, the Council of Pavia, who was over the Council of Pavia? Well, none other than Pope Benedict VIII, who was over the council and approved the council. And I think Bellarmine argues that all local councils approved by a pope are infallible. I believe he makes that argument in one of his books on the papacy. Be that as it may, the Pope approved of the council, obviously, because he's presiding over it. He's one calling it and presiding over it. And it did a whole bunch of things, but it also included that the children of clerics, even those born of free women, they were to become slaves of the church. So now you have not just like local councils, you also have the situation where these councils are put into the code of canon law, being used then universally. But also you now have popes authorizing this. Okay. And by the way, let me make sure we're doing okay here in the chat. Y'all, please let me know if you're having difficulties hearing me or seeing me. Okay. Oh, yeah, happy to add y'all as mods. No problem. I see the comments there, Jimmy. I can do that. Just if you can, maybe remind me towards the end of the stream or in another stream, if you don't mind. Everything's good with the audio and video. Okay, good. All right, so in 1089, at the Synod of Melfi, Pope Urban II enforced celibacy, clerical celibacy, by granting to secular princes the power to reduce the wives of clerics to slavery. This decree was also incorporated into the Western Church's collections of canons. So you have this being asserted by multiple popes, multiple councils, incorporated into canon law. So you can see this is very, very much official. It's not like a one-off thing. It's not merely disciplinary, but it's being put into the official canons of the church based on what? Based on doctrines, and especially the doctrine that slavery is a consequence of sin. So while all humans are equal, sin introduces this divine ordinance of slavery, and therefore that accounts for God authorizing slavery in the Bible. That's how they perceived it, right? That's how popes previously and the church previously perceived it. Nowadays, the church is saying something a little different. It's nowadays saying those things are not to be admitted, they're immoral, and the reason why it's immoral is because it's against human dignity. But it sidesteps the conversation that, yeah, the popes and church fathers were aware of human dignity, but then they said it's still authorized because of sin. And there isn't that conversation about sin today in these documents of the magisterium, which isn't very surprising because there isn't a whole lot of conversation about sin in general in a lot of these documents, especially in the post-conciliar period. That's not controversial. Most people have made that observation already. So there's still more work that needs to be done in accounting for these things and explaining the shift in the magisterium on the question, which is, again, why I'll continue to beat the drum that I think the magisterium needs to do some work here in explaining this to people, rather than just kind of making laity have to figure it out by themselves and then relying on their private interpretation and private judgment on how to make it all work together. Okay, so that's it for today. I will, in the next episode, cover the cases of papal bulls authorizing and approving of slavery. After that, we will go over church fathers, and then after that, Catholic states and laws by Catholic states. Make sure to let me know if you have any questions there in the comment section. I'll be on the lookout for them. And of course, hit the like button and hit the subscribe button. We'll see you later.